Where I would start is my experience. I used to work as a software engineer, did that for over 5 years. Alongside of that, I also really started getting into activism and kind of side by side for a few years was doing both. And then have now fully transitioned. I work at Climate Defiance currently, and I'm also very connected and tapped into a lot of the broader climate justice Bay Area. And a lot of what I focus on, one is art, but less so relevant to right now. But the other big key thing I really enjoy doing with my time in activism is more direct action and protests. So with that said, I'm no expert by any means and would very much love to answer folks' questions or thoughts as they come up. And if I don't know the answer, I may come back to you or something like that in a little bit. Um, so for today, the thing I wanted to preface this all with, and I think is really important and good for new folks with why should you care about digital security? And what I think of is for folks that are just getting into activism or are doing activism in specific ways, I think one thing and one good thing to notice is that you never know where your activism will take you and where you might kind of evolve or be a part of in later down the road. And some of this could potentially get into some things that we'll talk about as far as different threats or things to your privacy, your digital security. Um, on the other side, I think it's really important for folks to realize that what you might be doing now, if you were to get, if things were to happen later down the line, some of that could be relevant now, based on what kind of platforms you're using or other data you're putting out in the world. So we'll get into a little bit more there. And I think just in general, I think there's always a big balance between how secure you are and accessibility. And I think finding that right piece for yourself is really important as you kind of review, ask questions, get involved in understanding it a bit more for yourself. So next slide. We'll start off with what I'm really going to go through today is just a portion of a lot of the digital security in the activism world. And a lot of it is more so geared to your phones and in the context of joining a protest. This could look like a big march with thousands of people that happen maybe in San Francisco or Sacramento. Could be some or other sorts of things, you name it. A lot of them carry different types of risks, different types of surveillance, different types of tones. And I think those are also really important as you look into this. So when should I be careful with my phone and how I interact with it? So the key things I think here, one I think is very obvious is when it comes to protests or activism or things that may involve law enforcement around in that context. The other piece that I think is important is more so if you're being very critical of the government or critical of politicians or other things, and how you might put that data, maybe you're text messaging someone or WhatsApp, or maybe you're so bold you put it on your Facebook story or something about how you feel. And a good rule of thumb that I try to employ with myself is if it's not a secure platform, if I'm putting this right here, would I feel comfortable if this was read to me in court someday? I think that's just a really good rule of thumb you can always go back to based on, again, your own context and where and what you might be leading towards kind of in your activism career. So big reasons why this matters, social movements and law enforcement, they've always maybe not gotten along too much in the past and still to this day. And also why it's really relevant is the rise of technology, voice recognition, cameras literally everywhere. So many things that I think if you were to focus that on your day, it could be very scary. But we also want to feel really empowered as we walk into environments like this. So some threats to consider are, one is like monitoring of communications. So especially kind of in a protest setting, some ways based on how law enforcement is acting and how much they care at a given time, they may be able to tap into normal text messages or other things that you might be doing. Location tracking, this could be relevant that it shows a history of how you've been moving about at a certain time, if your phone was maybe confiscated, or if it was somehow gathered that information later. And another thing is kind of as the collective, sometimes if they can grab a large part of data from folks, they can start mapping a bunch of activist networks together and kind of understanding who are the people that are collaborating with each other and things like that. Next slide. So the number one advice I would say, if you're going to a protest that maybe will experience a large presence of law enforcement, or maybe is something that you are doing that may have a little bit more risks involved or more in a direct action space, do you need your phone? A common thing that folks do is kind of maybe they meet with some of their friends, and one of their friends who maybe won't go to the protest will just hang on to it for them. Maybe if you're driving over to it, you might leave it in your car in a safe spot, and other things like that. I think, of course, you want to balance the two of, what role are you taking? Sometimes you might be needing to communicate with people while you're there, or maybe you're taking photo and video with your phone for that day. And another is, what is your own accessibility needs? And, maybe it just it's not possible for you. So if that is the case, we'll go to the next slide and we'll see just some things that you can do if you kind of need to have your phone there. In some ways you can help protect yourself. So the first one is talking about Signal. Signal is an app. I believe you can just type into a search engine Signal. Should be pretty common these days. It essentially is just like iMessage or WhatsApp, very similar in that regard. The one key thing that makes it different is that it's encrypted. And essentially what that means is, on a normal text message, when you send that, that data is essentially going into Apple, and Apple hosts that data, and then that gets sent to the person where they can read it. And where that data is saved, it has your message and everything laid out just in the way that you wrote it. When it's encrypted, what Signal will do is Signal will hold that data, but it will have this encrypted, it will encrypt the message, meaning that it transforms it into some random string of digits, numbers, text, other things like that, to where if they were to get into that data, they would have no idea what it is, because it's essentially, I like to think of it as like, I send a Signal message, the algorithm will mix up the Rubik's Cube and save the Rubik's Cube somewhere. And then when you go read that message from the other person's phone, it undoes the Rubik's Cube in the way that it was sent. And then you see it in that way. So it essentially protects it a lot better. I could talk all day about Signal and what it is and encryption. Love that stuff. But more particularly with Signal, again, it's a good place to, if you want to express some feelings about how you feel about the world with someone else, if you wanted to message that to someone. Another thing important for if you're kind of coordinating or have like a role in an action or a protest, there's a setting called Disable Message Preview. And essentially what that means is, if your phone were to be obtained by law enforcement and you're continuing to get messages, it'll just say new message. It won't actually read the whole message out there when your phone is still locked. And then the last one is there's a few other settings, disappearing messages is like another setting you can kind of fiddle with, your name, how you're discoverable. There's a lot of things that you can kind of tailor to your way, kind of in the privacy settings on your phone. Then let's talk about just kind of in general with your phone. You'll hear this a lot, especially when you go into actions where law enforcement may confiscate your phone afterwards. is you want to disable biometrics. And what that essentially means is any Face ID or fingerprint, essentially any way that you can get into your phone based on what your body is or your layout. Um, because a common thing that law enforcement may do is after arresting someone, they will just take their phone and put it up to their face to unlock it, and see if it unlocks. And it's as easy as that. Um, so disabling those for your lock screen, if not, to get into your phone, having a 6-digit at least code, or maybe an alphanumeric is even better, because of just how much harder that is to crack kind of in those ways. The other thing you may possibly want to do is turn off Wi-Fi or location services. Um, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with mapping folks out or locating or tracking them throughout their time, possibly at like a huge march or rally. And that's a good way to protect against some of that, kind of when you need to. And then the last one is pretty easy. When your phone says update me, update it. Take that time. Usually you can plug it in your phone and it will do it during the nighttime. Usually that setting is up there, but that's a good way to continually get updates. It makes your phone a lot more secure and less so in a place where folks can hack into it. The last little portion to go into is just surveillance in general. I think it's good to just know that essentially anytime you're kind of walking in public or going a public way, there's going to be ways that, they'll see you. There's license plate cameras out there. There's public cameras on the street, in the subways, all that kind of stuff. I can't believe I just said subway. We're in the Bay Area on BART. um, and then the last thing is just around money and things like that. I think this is like something that I think is much more if it's in that more elevated kind of sphere around like when you might be using a credit card or like a BART card. If it's like something you want to be very careful about being tracked. Um, so yeah, so hopefully, I tried to mix in just like some more like top level things that are, I think, good to do and a lot more general, as alongside of some things that, based on what you might be doing, with like a group of people or in some way, a more direct action kind of focus, a little bit of that info too. And then if you go to the next slide, this resource is here, activistchecklist.org. It has a lot of the info, pretty much everything I talked about, and a whole lot more just to kind of read through. It gives you like a little bit of how long each section will take. And again, I think it's really important to kind of understand these things, figure out what works for you, alongside of, we want this to be accessible for you and want this to, I don't want you to feel scared about going to do or take any kind of step, or do something in this way. I think a lot of this is informed consent. It's where you can understand what the possibilities and the risks might be with some things you might do. And then for you to feel empowered to be like, I can take these precautions and I can do it. So with that, I'm going to pause, and I think we got about 5 minutes if anyone has questions, and feel free as well. You can ask me about something completely different and I can try to answer.
Thank you, Nikki. That was really great. Yeah, please either in the chat or just come off mute if you have any other questions.
Thanks so much, Nikki. So my question is maybe less about sort of the technical. I am really interested in these sorts of things. But something that comes up a lot of the times is like, why do you care so much about this? Like you're not doing anything illegal. And I think with kind of current uh goings ons, like that's a little bit more, it's like a little bit more self-evident, but I guess like how do you kind of talk to people about these sorts of things? Or like, is there sort of a totally law-abiding citizen, like kind of what is their stake in this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I would say to that is I think it's very much, it's a spectrum. I think there's no kind of golden answer, and I don't think it's like this, I am on this threshold, so I should be caring about this. I think where a lot of the gray area can really happen is, I think, in what I was mentioning with kind of criticisms or other type of talk about the government. Because something as simple as saying like F Trump or something like that could kind of classify into that sphere. And I think is something that I think a lot of people who are very law abiding might also fall into. Um, so I really think that a lot of this again is informed consent, and I think is not meant to kind of control over others, but more so to find agreements when you might be in some way doing something with them. So if you're maybe talking to someone that is not really going to protests or other stuff with you, it may not be the most relevant, but maybe if you're talking to them about how we are talking so much about Trump and in this very negative light and how much we don't like the government, then this is another story where then if that person isn't necessarily doing much, but you are, then you kind of get into this sphere where, hey, like, let's move this conversation to Signal, or let's like talk about it more in person rather than like this. So that's what I would say to that. I know it's a pretty like generic answer, but yeah.
Plus, I feel like there's some things that, I mean, I hate to say it, but like our current political climate, there's things that could be totally legal now that might not be totally legal later. I mean, we're seeing an increased criminalization of protesters and like cracking down on what we would previously consider free speech. And even if something wouldn't be considered like a crime, maybe they could use it as like character evidence or something of like, oh, well, obviously this person doesn't like this or whatever. And um yeah, and I think one of the things I've heard is that like if it doesn't need to be written down in a permanent place, don't write it down in a permanent place if it's anything you even have a question about.
Yeah, I actually had one more thing on this topic too, is I think identity and perceived identity is extremely important. We're seeing some students just getting swiped off the streets without doing anything, breaking any sort of law, and just having some sort of opinion or writing an op-ed about how they feel about the current state of the world. Um, so really in the climate that we live in, I think it's as well, this can be a really big way to talk to some folks that are in the frontline communities, BIPOC communities that are at more risk, and making sure that we're educating them. Cool. One more question time, or are we, I know we're at 5:30. Yeah, that is a great question, Sonja. I hope I said your name right. I I think ICE is less inclined to come to large events. Um, I think the way that they operate is trying to possibly come to like after like everyone goes home from an event, and trying to maybe track people down that way, or more so targeting specific locations like college campuses or other things like that, or different workplaces where some of this has kind of shown up. But it's a really good thing. And we've started to, with folks, kind of a part of like the organizing of a different event, is to really talk about what is our plan if this were to kind of happen in this way. And I think an example of that could be, um, there was a great Youth versus Apocalypse event around Earth Day a little bit ago, and just having some folks that understand kind of what to do if they were to be spotted, I think are really important things. Um, I think just a very quick resource for that is, there's these things called red cards and yellow cards, how allies and how folks a part of the community can kind of prepare for scenarios like that.
Thank you.
I'm also gonna put in the chat a website that you can use instead of Google Docs if you want to like put something down on a document, but you want to make sure it's encrypted and like I hate to say it, but Google isn't the most secure platform for your data, especially if you're doing anything at any risk to yourself. And somebody told me recently that if you make a free account, you don't have to put any information in, then you can that enables you to be able to delete things permanently if you create it without an account. It might not be deleted permanently, but they're still much more secure for anything, you know, that you want to make sure is safe than like a Google Doc. And also if you are able to get like a VPN, which encrypts your usage of your computer a lot more, things like that, I've also heard are quite useful.